Jerubbaal's story begins in a time of fear and oppression, when the Midianites ruled over Israel with cruelty, raiding their lands, stealing their crops, and leaving the people hiding in caves. Into this climate of despair steps Gideon, a man who saw himself as the least of the least, weak, ordinary, and unworthy. Yet God calls him not because of what he is in his own eyes, but because of what he can become in God's hands. The turning point of his life comes not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, dangerous obedience of a single night. God commands him to tear down the altar of Baal that stands in his father's yard, the very symbol of Israel's compromise with false worship. This is no small act. Baal was not only a foreign god, he was embedded into the culture, woven into the daily life of the people. Tearing down his altar was not just about smashing stones. It was about challenging an entire world view, a way of life that had taken root in the hearts of the nation. Gideon obeys, but he does so under cover of darkness, aware that the people will rage against him for attacking what they revere. In the morning, the town awakes to see Baal's altar in ruins, replaced by an altar to the living God, with a burnt offering laid upon it. Outrage surges through the crowd, and they demand Gideon's death. But his father, once a keeper of that very altar, defends him with words that echo through the centuries. If Baal is truly a god, let him contend for himself. From that day, Gideon is called Jerubbaal. Let Baal contend against him. It becomes more than a nickname. It becomes a declaration of identity. His very name is a challenge to false gods and a testimony that no idol can stand against the living God. Jerubbaal's example teaches us that the first battle in any calling is not out there in the world. It is in our own house, our own heart, our own community. Before Gideon could lead armies or see miracles, he had to confront the compromise closest to him. It is easier to dream of fighting distant battles than it is to dismantle the comfortable altars we have grown used to. The altar of Baal stood in Gideon's backyard, and God required him to face it head on. In the same way, God will often call us to challenge the false gods that live right where we are gods of tradition, of materialism, of self-interest, that we or our loved ones have come to trust more than Him. This act also reveals the risk inherent in obedience. Jerubbaal's obedience nearly cost him his life before his public mission had even begun. To follow God's call often means being misunderstood, opposed, and even hated by those around us. Yet the risk is the refining fire that solidifies our identity. Once Gideon became Jerubbaal, there was no turning back. His stand had drawn the battle lines. His name proclaimed to every friend and enemy alike that he had chosen his side. Jerubbaal's courage was not inborn. It was forged through action. The fear he felt did not disqualify him. It became the backdrop against which his obedience shone brighter. In God's economy, courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. His example reminds us that every great calling begins with a moment when you decide that God's voice matters more than the crowd's opinion. Jerubbaal was not yet the mighty leader who would rout the Midianite armies, but in tearing down that altar, he had already won the most important victory, the victory over compromise and silence. That is the foundation from which every true servant of God must rise. In ancient times, idols were carved from wood, shaped from stone, and covered in gold. They stood in temples and high places, their images fixed before the eyes of those who bowed to them. Today, our idols rarely have faces or physical forms, yet they are no less real and no less demanding. Modern idols are built in the heart and in the mind. They are not merely the things we own, but the things we trust, love, and obey more than God. They take the shape of desires, fears, and ambitions that subtly dethrone the one who deserves our full devotion. We do not burn incense to them or offer sacrifices upon their altars, yet we sacrifice our time, our integrity, our relationships, and even our souls in their name. Greed is one of the most pervasive of these idols. It wears the mask of ambition, but it enslaves the heart to an endless hunger for more. More wealth, more possessions, more power. Like Baal promising rain, greed promises satisfaction, but delivers only thirst. Many spend their entire lives in pursuit of a lifestyle or a bank balance, believing that security lies in abundance. Yet when storms come, the idol of greed cannot save. It demands loyalty but offers no protection. Pride is another god of our age. It bows to no authority, elevates the self above all, and measures worth by comparison to others. Pride resists correction, despises humility, and blinds the heart to the truth. In our modern culture, pride often disguises itself as self-confidence or self-expression, but when examined closely, it reveals itself as a throne reserved for the self alone. It subtly whispers, "You don't need God, you can be your own." This was the very lie in Eden, the seed from which all other idolatries grow. Lust, too, holds countless hearts in captivity. It exploits the natural desires for intimacy and beauty, distorts them, and reduces people to objects for gratification. In our hyper-connected, image-driven world, lust is fed daily through screens and media, shaping how we view others and ourselves. It enslaves with momentary pleasure and leaves deep scars in its wake. Like every idol, it promises fulfillment but produces emptiness. Fear is perhaps the quietest yet most controlling idol of all. Fear dictates decisions, silences truth, and keeps people trapped in cycles of inaction. Fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of failure. These are powerful forces that can control a life as completely as any carved image ever did. Fear demands that we play it safe, bow to comfort, and never step into the calling God has placed before us. Then there is the idol of cultural conformity, the God that demands we think, speak, and live exactly as the world dictates. This idol does not require belief in any supernatural being, only total allegiance to the shifting morals and values of the day. It tells us to avoid offending others at all costs, even if that means compromising truth. It thrives on silence, on our willingness to let lies go unchallenged because the cost of speaking out seems too high. Modern idols are subtle, but they are ruthless. They do not stand in temples, yet they demand our worship through our priorities and choices. The call to be like Jerubbaal is a call to identify and tear down these unseen altars, starting with the ones in our own hearts. It requires honest self-examination and the courage to confront what we have come to love more than God. These idols may not have names like Baal or Asherah, but they are just as destructive and just as certain to fall when faced with the living God. The call of God rarely comes wrapped in convenience or comfort. More often, it interrupts our plans, challenges our security, and asks for obedience in the face of uncertainty. Gideon's story illustrates this perfectly. When God found him, he was threshing wheat in a wine press, hiding from the Midianites, simply trying to survive. He was not looking for a mission. He was looking for safety. Yet the angel of the Lord called him a mighty warrior and sent him to deliver Israel. In that moment, Gideon faced the choice every follower of God must face. Will I cling to comfort, or will I step into my calling? Comfort is seductive because it feels safe. It tells us that if we can just maintain what we have, avoid unnecessary risks, and keep life predictable, we will be fine. But comfort is also deceptive. It lulls us into inaction and robs us of the growth, purpose, and impact that only come from stepping into what God has prepared for us. Comfort demands that we protect ourselves. Calling demands that we trust God. Comfort says, stay where it's safe. Calling says, follow me into the unknown. Gideon could have refused. He could have argued that he was too weak, too unimportant, too ill-equipped to lead an army. In fact, he did raise those objections, and God patiently answered them. Yet at the heart of Gideon's hesitation was the same tension we face: comfort over calling. Choosing calling means embracing discomfort. It means facing fears, risking failure, and stepping into situations where our own strength is not enough. In our time, calling might not lead you to a battlefield, but it will lead you out of your comfort zone. It might mean standing for truth when it costs you friends or opportunities. It might mean giving generously when you feel like holding back. It might mean leaving behind a career that offers financial security to pursue work that impacts lives in a deeper way. It might mean speaking up when silence feels safer. The danger of choosing comfort over calling is that comfort never lasts. Life changes, circumstances shift, and the things we rely on for security can be taken away in a moment. If our lives are built on comfort, we will always be at the mercy of whatever threatens it. But when we choose calling, we anchor ourselves to God's purpose, which does not depend on changing circumstances. Gideon discovered that God's calling came with God's presence. When the Lord told him to go, he also said, "I will be with you." That promise is the same for us today. God does not call us into the unknown to abandon us. He calls us there to reveal His power in ways we would never see if we stayed where we were. The discomfort of calling becomes the very place where faith grows and miracles happen. Choosing calling over comfort is not a one-time decision. It is a daily choice to say yes to God's voice, even when it disrupts our plans. It is a willingness to be stretched, to be led into places where we are dependent on Him. Gideon's life was transformed not because he had a grand strategy or perfect courage, but because he answered when God called. The same is true for us. Comfort may feel good for a season, but only calling will leave a legacy that matters in eternity. One of the most striking parts of Gideon's story is the way God intentionally reduced his strength before giving him victory. When Gideon first gathered his army to face the Midianites, there were 2,000 men ready to fight. It was a respectable force, but God saw a problem. Not that it was too small, but that it was too big. If Israel won with such numbers, they might boast and believe they had saved themselves. So God began to strip the army down. First 2,000 men went home out of fear. Then, of the 10,000 remaining, only 300 were selected not for their skill, but for a simple act of how they drank water from a stream. This reduction was no accident. It was God's way of ensuring that the coming victory would be undeniably His. This moment reveals a truth that runs throughout Scripture. God delights in using weakness to display His strength. It is not human ability that brings about God's purposes, but divine power working through surrendered vessels. We see it in David, the shepherd boy who defeated a giant with a sling. We see it in Moses, the stammering fugitive who confronted Pharaoh and led a nation to freedom. We see it in the disciples, ordinary fishermen and tax collectors, who carried the gospel to the ends of the earth. And we see it in Gideon, who faced an army as numerous as locusts with a mere 300 men armed with trumpets, jars, and torches. In human terms, this makes no sense. We are taught to rely on our resources to gather strength, to prepare as much as possible before attempting something significant. Yet God often does the opposite. He allows us to be reduced, to face situations that strip away our self-reliance, so that when the breakthrough comes, there is no doubt who deserves the glory. Weakness becomes the stage on which God's power shines brightest. This principle challenges our natural instincts. We resist weakness because it makes us feel vulnerable and out of control. We want to fix our flaws, accumulate resources, and be self-sufficient. But God's strength is perfected in weakness, not in self-sufficiency. When the Apostle Paul pleaded with God to remove his thorn in the flesh, the Lord replied, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul's response was radical. He began to boast in his weaknesses, understanding that they were the very places where Christ's power could rest on him. Gideon's victory was a living example of this truth. 300 men, making noise in the night, broke jars and blew trumpets, creating chaos in the Midianite camp. The enemy turned on itself and fled without a real battle. Israel's deliverance was not the result of military might, but of God's intervention. If Gideon had fought with 32,000 soldiers, the story would have been about strategy and human bravery. With 300, it became a testimony to God's power. In our own lives, God's strength in weakness means that the very areas we think disqualify us may be the ones He uses most powerfully. It means that when we feel inadequate, God sees an opportunity. It means that our lack is not a barrier to His work, but an open door for His grace. We are not called to hide our weakness in shame, but to bring it before Him in faith, trusting that He can do far more through surrendered insufficiency than we could ever do through polished ability. God is not looking for the strongest, the most talented, or the most influential. He is looking for those who will trust Him completely. When we embrace that truth, weakness no longer feels like defeat. It becomes the very place where the Almighty chooses to reveal Himself. Defiance against falsehood is at the heart of Jerubbaal's story. When Gideon tore down the altar of Baal, he was not simply breaking religious tradition. He was openly rejecting a lie that had been accepted as truth in his community. Baal was worshipped as if he had power to bless or curse, but in reality he was nothing, an idol, a fabrication of human imagination. Still, the people had built their lives around this falsehood, and anyone who dared challenge it risked social outrage, personal loss, and even death. Gideon's act was not passive disagreement. It was active confrontation. He did not simply walk away from Baal's altar. He destroyed it and replaced it with an altar to the Lord. This is what defiance against falsehood looks like, not merely refusing to believe a lie, but dismantling its influence and replacing it with truth. Falsehood has many forms in every generation. It can be a blatant lie, a twisted half-truth, or a cultural norm that stands in direct opposition to God's Word. Sometimes it comes as false religion or idolatry. Other times it is the subtle redefinition of morality, the celebration of what God calls sin, or the silencing of truth in the name of tolerance. The danger of falsehood is that it does not just deceive, it demands loyalty. It pressures people to conform, punishes dissent, and rewards those who promote it. This is why defiance is costly. In our world today, falsehood thrives in systems, ideologies, and media narratives that seek to reshape the way people think and live. It tells us that truth is subjective, that good and evil are determined by public opinion, that personal happiness is the highest goal. It replaces the authority of God with the authority of self, encouraging everyone to live their truth, while rejecting the idea of absolute truth. To stand against these lies is to invite criticism, ridicule, and sometimes outright hostility. But silence in the face of falsehood is not neutrality, it is surrender. Defiance against falsehood is not driven by pride or rebellion. It is fueled by allegiance to a higher authority. For the believer, that authority is God's unchanging word. Gideon did not act because he thought his personal opinion was better than the crowd's. He acted because God had spoken. When God's truth comes into conflict with human tradition, human opinion must bow. This conviction gives courage to stand even when the cost is high. Defiance against falsehood also requires more than words. Many claim to believe in truth, but do little to defend or live it out. Gideon's obedience was visible and disruptive. It left no doubt where he stood. In the same way, we are called not just to privately reject lies, but to live in a way that exposes them. This may mean confronting injustice, refusing to participate in corrupt systems, or speaking truth when it is unpopular. It may mean losing opportunities, relationships, or reputation. But every act of obedience plants a seed of truth that has the power to outlast the lies of the age. Falsehood is powerful when unchallenged, but it is fragile when exposed to truth. Just as Baal could not defend himself against Jerubbaal's challenge, the lies of our generation cannot stand against the living truth of God. The question is whether we will have the courage to contend against them. Defiance is not about winning an argument. It is about living in such alignment with truth that lies lose their hold. In every age, God calls people to stand as Jerubbaals, those who will not bow, who will not be silent, and who will make it clear that the gods of falsehood have no power when the Lord reigns. Personal responsibility is the unshakable understanding that no one else can fulfill the mission God has given you. It is the awareness that your choices, your actions, and your obedience, or your refusal, carry real consequences not only for yourself, but for those around you. In Gideon's case, the call to be Jerubbaal was not a call he could delegate. No one else could tear down his father's altar to Baal. No one else could lead Israel in that exact moment. God had chosen him, and the weight of that choice meant that he had to respond. Personal responsibility begins when we stop waiting for someone else to do what God has clearly placed in our hands. In every generation, there is a temptation to shift responsibility onto others. We hope a leader will rise up, that someone braver, wiser, or more qualified will take the stand we know needs to be taken. We excuse ourselves by saying we are too busy, too weak, or too small to make a difference. But this mindset ignores a fundamental truth. God works through individuals who are willing to say yes. Your calling is not transferable. If you do not step into it, the opportunity may pass to someone else, but the loss will be yours, and the blessing of obedience will be missed. Taking personal responsibility also means refusing to hide behind excuses. Gideon initially tried to avoid his calling by pointing out his weaknesses, his low family status, his lack of influence. We often do the same, magnifying our limitations while forgetting that God's power is the deciding factor. Personal responsibility calls us to shift our focus from what we lack to the one who has called us. If he has given us an assignment, he has also given us the means, through his strength, to fulfill it. It also requires ownership of our influence. Every person has a sphere of impact, family, friends, coworkers, community members, who are watching how we live. When we compromise, others notice. When we stand firm, others are strengthened. Gideon's act of tearing down Baal's altar sent a message to his entire town. The time of bowing to false gods was over. Our own acts of faith send similar messages, even when we do not see the full ripple effect. Personal responsibility is not about perfection, it is about faithfulness. There will be moments of fear, hesitation, and even failure. But the measure of responsibility is whether we keep showing up, keep obeying, and keep pressing forward when it would be easier to quit. Gideon faced not only the challenge of confronting idols, but also the monumental task of leading a vastly outnumbered army. At every stage, the temptation to step back must have been strong, but he continued because the call was his to carry. In the same way, each of us must decide whether we will live passively or intentionally. Passivity waits for conditions to be ideal before acting. Intentionality acts in faith, trusting God with the outcome. Personal responsibility compels us to act now, in the strength we have. because the world will not wait, and the stakes are too high. When we stand before God, we will not give account for what others did with their opportunities. We will give account for what we did with ours. Personal responsibility means living each day with that reality in mind, making choices that reflect obedience, courage, and trust. It is the resolve to be like Jerubbaal, not waiting for someone else to contend with the gods of this age, but stepping forward to do what must be done, knowing that God is with us and the battle is His.